afternoon, good morning, good evening. No matter where you are in this fine land of ours, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's going to be a fun one, folks, let me tell you. We're talking about change management. We all deal with it. Companies grow, companies shrink, economies change, and that impacts the culture, the organization, and the results. So what do you do if you're a leader in a company? How do you handle that? Well, let me tell you. We're not only going to bring you 5 key approaches for growth, emphasis on the growth, we're going to bring you 2 dynamic personalities in Peter Evans and Michael Birch. And what's so cool about that is that when we set this event up, folks, we said we need to represent both an expert from a professional services background who understands that game and an expert from a product background who understands that game. And let's bring them together. Let's compare the notes and let's see what we can do for you as part of sharing the knowledge. Best off, though, guess what? This is real time. This is live. You get to ask questions. So the question is, how do you do that? Very straightforward. What you do is you can go into the control panel, and whether you got a Windows or a Mac or a tablet, you see it there in front of you, to the questions section, and simply submit your questions there in real time. If you have a question for a specific panelist, in this case Peter or Michael, you can certainly say that. Otherwise, I'll ask whoever wants to answer it. We'll do that afterwards, though. So how this works is we're going to go through the core content first, and then we're going to open up the Q&A afterwards. One of the questions we always get asked is, are you recording this? The answer is absolutely we are. So within about 48 hours, give or take, you're going to get an email with a link to today's recording that you can share, you can review, you can use for a reference over and over again. Beyond that, we're actually going to tell you how you can reach out to Michael or Peter one-on-one and just pick their brain and see what they think. So today's going to be a lot of transparency, a lot of honesty, a lot of hard, lessons learned. So let's get on and let's meet our actual panelists. I mentioned we're talking about Michael and Peter, so let me see if I can introduce you to these 2 fine gentlemen. So Michael joined the Welsh LLP team in 1978 after graduating from the University of Ottawa. He went on to receive his CA designation in 1981 and his Certified Financial Planner designation thereafter. Now, interesting enough, talk about change management, he actually left the firm for a few years and he actually gained some critical experience in the entrepreneurial owner-managed space. So he's walked in your shoes. He returned to the tax group at Welsh LLP in 1990. He was made a partner in 93. And in 2006, he took over the role of the Ottawa office managing partner, a role he fulfills to this day. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
All right. Now, Peter's an interesting cat, let me tell you. He brings over 20 years of corporate and consulting experience working in software, internet services, online media, and the telecom industries. And that's just scratching the surface, folks. He's consulted over hundreds of companies, both as an outside advisor, a consultant, and an employee. He's seen the wars. He's fought them, let me tell you. He specializes on developing strategy and marketing programs for companies operating in complex, competitive markets with a key focus on technology and business model innovation. After all, isn't that what change management's all about? Over the years, his work with clients as diverse as TELUS, DoubleClick, Google, and the Mars Innovation Center has been recognized through industry awards such as the Deloitte Fast 50 and featured in media such as Inc. Magazine, Huffington Post, Strategy Magazine, and the Harvard Business Review Online. He's on to a new gig these days, folks. He recently founded expertfile.com. It's the world's first expert marketing software platform that serves clients such as Cleveland Clinic, ADP, and the Canadian Bar Association. He holds an MBA degree from Queen's University. Peter, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Daryl.
He's got that great radio voice, doesn't he? I tell you, it's going to be competition here.
Thank you very much.
Oh, look at that. Michael, tell me a bit about Welsh, just for the audience, for context. You're the managing partner there. What do they do?
So Welch, full-service public accounting firm, started in 1918. We do a good consulting work as well, tax, business planning, advisory services, audit. Probably one of the largest independents still in the country.
Probably you're being shy. You're right up there. Welsh is quite accomplished. Check them out at welshllp.com. But Peter, for the other side of the game, the product side, talk to me about ExpertFile.
Well, we're like LinkedIn for the enterprise, we like to say. I used to sort of avoid the comparison, but LinkedIn isn't doing a lot of things for corporations these days in terms of marketing their experts. Inherently, LinkedIn is a profile that employees build themselves. We allow corporate communications people to build profiles for their people. So essentially driving through that published expert content, more market visibility, better engagements with media, with conference organizers, and with business prospects, and then the ability to measure the progress of their expert marketing programs.
What's cool about Expert File, folks, is that today's world really is about do the research first online. Talk to reviewers, talk to other people, social media channels, do the background check before you ever engage a vendor or an individual. Expert File is all about curating that content, and so you can find the experts in a heartbeat. It's phenomenal. Check it out. We're actually customers, full disclosure, because it just simply rocks. So, Peter, with that said, I want to open up the conversation to what we're going to cover today, if that's okay. We're going to talk about, folks, vision, culture, brand, leadership, and investment. These are the 5 key things we're going to do. Why are we doing that? Because it's about setting out a plan for growth, changing your mindset. You want to be entrepreneurial. It's about changing the visibility, okay? You want to be visible. Again, Expert File is a good example of that. But I think Michael's going to talk to you. You don't become a company that's almost 100 years old if you don't maintain focus and momentum. And then it's finally, if you really want to impact the world, you got to cultivate the conditions for growth. So we'll set the stage. Vision, Michael, so when we say vision, we set the stage already, setting out a plan for growth, but what does that really mean to you?
So for us, it's actually funny. It's come full circle because Peter Evans was instrumental in this for us. I met with Peter. We wanted to do a bit of a rebranding when I took over as managing partner. And we thought we'd been doing fairly well. And so Peter said, well, how well have you done? And we talked a bit about that. And he said, have you compared that to the rest of your industry? And it turns out that, you know what? With respect to the industry, we were just sort of like on the curve. We weren't really ahead of the industry, so we weren't really doing more than we should have. So we sort of embarked on a vision, and if we could just think big, what would we like to be? And we'd love to be a boutique firm that set some big goals and went after some big accounts, and were able to succeed at that. So with that in mind, we set out on a new 5-year plan, and that was our vision, to be this dynamic boutique type firm.
So now, as I look at some of these points, you talk about your experience with Michael. Was that leading into thinking about tomorrow versus working for today? That point you were just discussing?
Absolutely. So if I look back at the way we'd been operating, we'd been around for 90 years or 92 years at the time, but we'd done a lot of the same thing year in and year out. So it was wrong for us to think that we could achieve this vision and continue to do the same thing. So that's where we get into this world of change. It was clear that we were going to have to change a number of things if we were going to be the firm that we wanted to be.
And part of that being the firm you wanted to be, this word audacious. Talk to me about setting audacious goals.
So, and I dealt a bit with Peter on this, it's one thing to say, okay, where do we want to be in 5 years? And if there's a good chance you're not going to be exactly where you want to be. So if you set an audacious goal, if you set out to do something really fantastic and you hit 80% of that, you're still probably way ahead of where you would have done if you'd set some goals that you felt were attainable. So that's the whole idea about audacious goals. Let's just go after this in a big way and see where we end up.
Now that sounds pretty bold, but like your point here about identifying the steps required. You're going to make those audacious goals, but they're high level. So this is a little bit to me like where the rubber meets the road.
Sure. So then, how does that come into play? How do you actually become that firm you expect you're going to be? And a lot of it has to do with educating the people that you're working with day in and day out, and trying to get them on board with, you know what, that sounds like a great place to be, and let's all pull together and try and get there. So that's when you start to get into trying to manage the small amount of change and just take little steps that will ultimately lead you to where you want to be.
There's got to be a story here, Know Your Enemy. What's that about?
Well, it's funny. You read Know Your Enemy, and immediately you sort of think, well, who's our competition? Who's our enemy out there? But often your enemy can be yourself, too. So if I've got 30 staff members that have been with us for 20 years and sort of have become comfortable doing it the way they're doing it and thinking that, nothing's broken here, why are you busy trying to fix it? They can become your enemy. So you really have to understand where the head mindset is of the people that are in your own shop and try and get them to come on board.
So Peter, what are your thoughts on vision? Because you're coming at it from a very different angle too. Clearly you consulted and helped give some input to Michael and Welsh, but you've been through the trenches.
Yeah, and just a thought on that last point to build on what Michael's talking about. I think in many ways, Michael wanted to sort of reframe the conversation with people inside the firm to understand that the current enemy isn't necessarily the future enemy, and that there's a lot of non-traditional competitors coming into the market. And we've seen a major change in professional services as a market with consolidation and a lot of factors that are happening around scale economics that you need to bring to a firm these days. And it's amazing that that Welch has been able to perform so well over past 7 years that I've known you, as an independent firm doing some of these things. But I think, to the point that you just asked about, Daryl, I think vision in many ways for me is around stretch versus fit. And there's a push and pull all the time. Good leaders, good CEOs, managing partners are setting stretch goals. People want to fit in. They see themselves inside a box, essentially, and these are my duties. It's very important that leaders right throughout the organization, and it's often set by the managing partner or the CEO in this case, you've got to impart these stretch goals all the way through the organization. So, and when you set strategy, vision is so important. It's one half of strategy. The other half is your capabilities, and understanding what sort of capabilities need to be built to realize that vision is really how you write a strategic plan every year, or a 3-year strategic plan. I think that one of the biggest things I've found with provoking an organization is this whole notion of, when you've got these market shifts happening, being able to respond very quickly to that, and having a long-term plan is great. But in the area that I work in, software and technology, there's just so much happening with regards to Moore's law dynamics, and how fast technologies can change. You've got to actually focus on quarterly sprints, not just on yearly plans or 3-year plans. Those have really gone out the window for a lot of companies, especially startups.
So talk to me about balancing core business with experiments. That one really caught my attention.
Yeah, I think in setting a vision, in setting strategy, way too many firms don't encourage their people to experiment enough and try new things. Certainly that's a truism. You've got to try new things, but actually putting programs together around what you are going to try, and then measuring it and seeing what worked and what didn't, and tracking some of the failures, and not necessarily celebrating the failures. I've heard that expression, but at least learning from them and not making the same mistake twice. But actually applying certain programs and seeing what works, and not necessarily creating an environment where people are afraid to take risks. That's a real problem if you're trying to push your people to stretch, and at the same time you're not tolerating some of these small issues or a failure. Now, the experiment is the whole notion of contained risk. And it's not necessarily betting the farm, but doing things in small batches, experiments, and seeing what's working. Pilot programs, and challenging people to say, okay, what new things are you going to try this quarter and throughout this year? How much of your marketing budget, for instance, is allocated beyond standard social media metrics or programs and standard, media relations and things like that? If we're looking at a functional discipline inside an organization, there's a good example. It's amazing just how people sort of, regress into just the usual activities unless they're provoked by the leadership to try those things. Eric Goodwin, a local sensation here, who I worked for at a company called Flow Network, one of the best tech CEOs I think I'll ever know, and certainly is a legend in the Ottawa area here, used to always talk about as much as necessary, as little as possible. And striking a balance between those two is absolutely essential. But he used to always come to me as a VP and say to me, what new things are you going to try this quarter? And what have you learned from it? And at the end of the day, what are you going to eliminate? Because he always focused on time, people, and money as being our 3 finite resources. Good leaders are conscious of the fact that there needs to be a resource allocation constantly if you're going to be trying new things. You can't squeeze people both ways. And that's what a good leader understands as well. What are you going to stop doing? And what are you going to experiment on, and where are you going to double down?
So I'm come back to Michael for a second, then
Sure.
we'll go on to the next topic about culture. But when you took over as managing partner, you had grand plans to take Welsh, to the next level, shall we say, right? That's
Yep.
what every good leader is supposed to do.
Yep.
But am I being stereotypical if I say accountants are not necessarily known for being adventurous, experimental, and aggressive?
No, I think you're right. I think just the nature of our training, the nature of the people that go into this profession would be one of conservative. So
Right, you want to reduce risk.
Yes, exactly. But you've also got to look at it that if everyone around you is advancing the cause and you're not, even though you're sort of still doing what you've been doing and doing it reasonably successful, eventually you're going to become insignificant in the marketplace, right? They're going to leave you behind. So when I looked at it, I thought, we really, with a lack of a lot of effort in this world, or in this area of the world, we've sort of done quite well. Just imagine what we could be capable of doing if we decided, let's get a bit aggressive with this and see where it takes us. And it's worked out quite well for us. The way we're seen in the marketplace right now is exponentially larger than it was. It used to be at a point where if I would meet someone and they'd say, "Well, who are you with?" I would say, "I was with Welch," and they'd say, "Well, oh, yeah, I know so and so there." And I'd say, "Yeah, well, did you know that so and so is just one of 150 people there?" And they would be shocked. So I think now, though, when we're out there and talking to these people, they recognize that, yeah, you guys are sort of getting to where you thought you'd be.
And what's cool, and we'll come back to this later on in the conversation. We'll move on here.
Yep.
But while I'm changing the slide, it's interesting because, I know, Michael, you had to go and evangelize that vision to the rest of the organization, and you learned some lessons out of that. So we'll share that with you shortly, folks. Just stay tuned. But now we're on culture. So I'm going to start with you, Peter, first. Just talk to me about, you talk about focusing on 7 habits. And this is not you as an individual, right? This is you instilling this into the DNA of the organization.
Yeah. And I think, good cultures are increasingly trying to understand what value they bring to customers. And one of the things that I'm really focused on these days is expertise. Obviously, with Expert File, that may sound self-serving, but it's a major trend right now, this notion of visible experts within the organization and really bringing people across the organization to up their game and be seen as promoters of the brand, of the firm. And some of the habits that I think leaders need to instill these days are that we want people to be more specialists and generalists. We're finding now, if you're doing, say, a LinkedIn profile or you're doing content online and you're trying to draw attention to yourself as a firm, it's important that you have your people be seen more as specialists. Specialists are in, generalists are out. And having that knowledge where you can educate the market as a specialist is key. Provocative is the next one, I think, is an important trait because you want to be challenging some of the current assumptions in your profession. And it's also important if you're looking from a business development point of view to get your people from a cultural perspective to get out to local events and network more, but also to look at their online presence. I'm amazed at when you try to identify what makes a firm tick, it's not just the website, it's not just social media. They're also going into LinkedIn profiles and looking at the quality of those. When you don't have a photo on your LinkedIn profile and you're a senior person with that firm, it looks like you don't care. And just forcing people, or at least trying to move them to develop a stronger online presence is really important, not just the rock stars and usual gurus within a firm. I think ambience is important as well. The fourth is the ambient, as I've said here. It's about relevant, regular updates from you as an expert or somebody within a firm or company to stay in touch with customers and prospects on a regular basis and create almost like an inbound pull so that when people have got problems, they'll reach out to you. And then you've got to give till it hurts. You've got to be helpful. It does hurt sometimes, to spend too much time with a client or prospect, but it pays back. I think it's a golden rule. And this whole notion of being resourceful is something that employees have got to learn more about. I think in this day and age, with the economy, in 2008, I think we've been very conditioned to hunker down and not try new things. But at the same time, it's incumbent on us to be more resourceful and try to create unexpected value out of bringing people together and bringing ideas together. And lastly, this whole notion of being responsive to requests that come in from the marketplace. You've got to be ready these days. Execs, as I say in the slide, they're like ferrets on a double espresso. They have a very, very short attention span. And quite frankly, the advice or the insight or the help you can deliver in the first 12 hours after an email comes in is a hell of a lot better like 2 or 3 days later. When you've had a lot of time to consolidate your thoughts and stuff, they're on to their next thing, or somebody else has come in and satisfied that need. So I think speed is actually becoming a very important trait of our culture these days. It's just the nature of business.
I look at this and I'm just maybe overwhelmed a little bit, right? Because my company's not responsive enough today. You talk about speed.
Yeah.
All right. If we're not provocative, because that's counterculture.
Yeah.
Today, right? How do I go about instilling that? So maybe I'll flip it back to you, Mike, a little bit, because that was part of your mandate when you were trying to spearhead that change at Welsh. You talk about identifying skill gaps and developing programs. Was that in response to this type of focus?
Right. So if you're asking all the people in your organization to change the way they've done things for a number of years, you've got to try and affect them emotionally and say, okay, well, why do I need to do this? Why is this going to be better for me, as well as rationally? And emotionally, they're probably sitting there saying, you know what, we're pretty busy already. We work really, really hard. And now you want us to do more work because you're going to be we're going to be out selling more business. We're going to be growing. So then well, that's a bit of a stumbling block. So how do you convince them that, you know what, it's going to be okay? And one of the things we did was we said, look, let's not work with these D clients anymore. And that's tough. It's tough to say to a client or to think that we don't want a certain client, but it's probably one of the best things we'll do, have done, started to do, and will continue to do. And that is to say, look, you're going to work harder, but you're going to work harder with people you really enjoy working with. So the big change there was to grade all our customers, set the sort of criteria of what makes a fantastic client. Let's grade them all, and let's find the ones that sit at the bottom of the pile, and let's move those out, because that's what's interfering with us to go out and get new business and to be more entrepreneurial minded. So that's sort of one of the small things we did to move in that direction.
Well, so you did exactly what Peter just said, going back to his Eric Goodwin analogy of, what are you going to take out so you can go free subbing up? That's exactly what you did. But I mean, this, you say you ask for the sale, but be selective about your customer. How do you hit those goals if you're being selective? I mean, isn't that you must have got objection on that? Yeah,
absolutely. But we created what we call pursuit teams, and I got to thank Peter Cleveland here in town for this idea. He was very helpful in this. But we went through the OBJ's books of lists, and we found 30 or 40 companies that we thought, you know what, we could service the heck out of those. We would be ideal for them. So then we decided, all right, now how are we going to get close enough to them so that they recognize that we're ideal for them? So that's sort of being selective about who our customers would be.
All right, so let's move on to the discussion of brand. And I know, Michael, I apologize about this, that I had Peter start first last time. But since he's, Peter's the marketing guru, I'm going to let him start with brand first.
That makes sense.
All right, so Peter, no pressure. But how do you get everyone working to build the brand? Because, I've worked with a lot of people that can't even spell brand.
Well, it's I think one of the key things we're seeing in professional services, and I'll take a stab at that first, and Mike will probably want to comment on this, but this whole notion of expert visibility and really trying to humanize the brand. That's what we're seeing a lot of right now. Brands in all sectors trying to really appear to be more approachable. Now, I like that word a lot because right now, from a brand perspective, we haven't really made our people all that approachable and showing some of the stories that go beyond the brand in terms of how they've added value to clients. So I think, this whole notion of Welch as a good example was this notion of going from a small-time player to a heavy hitter, as Mike likes to say. It was really about going in and first of all, doing some research on what customers were saying, what they actually perceived to be the strengths of the Welch brand, as a good example. I think looking at personas as well is important too, because going back to your point about customers, 80-20 rules often, they thread their way through how you approach the market as well. 80% of that business might be coming from a fifth of your customers. So looking at the different personas that you're approaching and how your brand's going to be seen by, whether it's a car dealer all the way through to somebody in the real estate area. And I've got clients that have, been the size of companies like TELUS all the way down to, two guys and an algorithm. It's very different in terms of what they're going after and the approach in terms of personas.
Yeah, so from our perspective, we wanted to have a brand that demonstrated the things that we were really good at. So as Peter said, we did a bunch of client research and found out, what it is about us that separates us. And then we tried to magnify that so that the outside world could see that about us. We became way more visible in the community. We attended way more events, and we asked our staff to just spend a couple of nights out and get to these events and get these people to know us. And now, I think when I go to these events, it's like, wow, you guys are at everything. So it's sort of working now. So that's just sort of building the awareness. Actually, what we do has sort of been positioned as a result of the research, and we can get that message out. And we did a few other things that perhaps other firms our size weren't doing. We hired a full-time business development guy, and we have a marketing group of 3 or 4 people, and that's been able to sort of change the perception out there of what Welch is and what we're capable of doing. So that's worked out really well.
And I think the other thing to mention too is, and I've talked about this whole notion of getting a distributed, amount of communication going out from everybody that represents the brand inside a firm or a company. And there's often just a disproportionate amount of people carrying the weight, and it's got to be spread out. And the leading companies are really getting with that program now and training people on what their pitch is. I think it's really important too that the kind of communications that customers want to see, especially when it's digital, and that's how about 56% of CB's done some studies on B2B markets saying that 57%, I believe, of decisions have been made already before sales is even contacted within the vendor organization. And that's because they're availing themselves of all this education that's online. And so content marketing is huge as a result. But I think one of the things that we're not doing enough of in the industry is actually focusing on the 4 Ps. And often we've talked about that as, product, place, pricing, and just the standard stuff. The new 4 Ps for me are around proof, pain, perspectives, and products. I think in many ways, people want to see the proof up front. I want to know that, for instance, Expert File has got the Cleveland Clinic as a client. Well, that's a proof point that suggests that you might want to learn a bit more about us as a company if we can serve those kind of clients. But it's as Malcolm Gladwell talks about the blink test. And you've got to blink test your branding and all of your corporate communications and your people to be ready for that 30-second moment. You may not even get 30 seconds online. But once I've got the proof of results and I'm hearing, client names dropped and actual numbers like, percentages and dollars saved, it's about addressing my pain points. People really want to focus on what's the issue of the day, what's keeping them up at night. And perspectives lead products. We always have at the tail end, we've got to talk about our product, but what leads product in a good discussion is perspectives around education, around your global view, how you fit into their worldview as a client, how they're going to work with your product. And what sort of industry research have you done that earns you the right to solve their problem? So again, in that order, proof, pain, perspectives, and product when we're communicating our value proposition.
I love that. Peter, the marketing guru, has created a new definition of 4 Ps. Proof, pains, perspectives, and product. That's fantastic. So that's awesome. All right, so let's move on to the next conversation, which is all about leadership. And Michael, you talk about playing the long game. This one got my attention. So what does that mean?
So I guess it's the way we are built. We're accountants. We're always looking at the next quarter results, the monthly statements, the annual statements. And every now and again, you got to step back and say, well, what's more important is where are we going to be in 10 years? And if where we need to be in 10 years is going to cost us a bit of money in the short run, it's worth spending that money now to strengthen us up for down the road. So I think to the credit of my partners, they recognized that and got on board with that and said, yeah, you know what, we understand. And we created this small sort of business school within Welch, Apex, where we try to get our staff. We're asking them to do all these changes, but what tools are we giving them to do that? And I think Apex, this in-house business school, has helped us give the tools to these staff members to say, yeah, you know what, now I have what I need to do what you're asking me to do.
That's pretty cool. So you actually built your own, mini university in-house.
Yeah. So we got a group of staff members at the senior level, and we got consultants from the MBA school at Telfer, a consultant from the commerce program at Telfer to sit on the board to help us create this program. We started out a year at a time. So these are the first year courses we want. Second year. So I think now we're at 3 levels with a 4th that's sort of special courses that drop on top of that. So all the way up to now, we just finished our partner training. So everybody's involved.
Why did you do that versus, say, just outsourcing it?
Because I think you outsource it, you sort of water it down a little bit. So anyone that's providing that kind of education on an outsourced basis has sort of got a broader picture of what they want you to embrace. We wanted to be more specialized. We wanted to make sure that we understand the education that it takes to get the designations in the various organizations, but we also understand that where that drops off and where running what we hope will be an entrepreneurial business development style firm, what do we need to add to the equation? What is it that we need? And for instance, a great example of that is we institute our own Toastmasters club. So our staff is telling us, I'm not really comfortable out and about like that. I get a little bit awkward. So how can you help me with that? So the way we help them with that was we put a Toastmasters club in place. They meet once a week, and the results have been dramatic. Some of the staff members now that are providing presentations and training to our staff, it's like they're light years ahead of where they were when we started with all of this.
See, that's the thing that was jumping out at me as I was listening to you two gents talking. I'm thinking those poor introverted employees who don't want to change or ask for the sale or
Yeah.
network. They must be dying. But your point about Toastmasters is a phenomenal response. But that all said, not everybody adapts. Talk to me about this bullet you've got here, because I think it's a huge point. Expect turnover as a result of the change.
Yeah, so there's two options there, and with some of the more senior staff, you can't expect them to just change what they've been doing for 30 or 40 years. So the main point with them is like, okay, look, I understand you're not going to get with the program, but do not interfere with the program. Anytime you're discussing it, be supportive of it and step aside, but don't get in the way of it. And then certain people, it just quickly becomes evident to them that they think where we're heading is not where they want to go, and it's unfortunate, but we're not the perfect place for everybody, and when you're in the midst of change, that sort of gets reflected more quickly.
And what's interesting is that it's almost domino effect sometimes, right? Because if somebody leaves because they're not the right person, that person is buddies with two other people, and they're offended that you created an environment that they weren't going to be successful. Now they want to leave too because their buddy's gone. That's tough.
That's tough. I mean, we've been fortunate. Our staff, I think, enjoy where they are, so we haven't lost a lot of staff in that regard. We've been very fortunate. Usually, our profession is all about turnover. Bring them in, educate them, spend a few years when they get their CAs and they want to move on to industry. But we've been lucky. A lot of our great staff have hung around.
Now, Peter, you're going to not talk about your experience here. It looks like you got a few thought leaders in the industry you want to reference.
Yeah, in the area of resources, a couple of people that I've been impressed by in the readings that I've done, people like Ben Horowitz, who writes a great blog at Andreessen Horowitz, one of the top VC firms on the planet right now in venture capital, investing in some of those really dynamic startups that are going to shape the new economy. And what I like about Ben Horowitz is that he focuses on talent. And really, in some ways, a lot of the articles that you've seen on Andreessen Horowitz talks about their differentiating factor is around human capital and just how they staff their companies and help their CEOs of their investee companies hire the right people and getting the right people on the bus. In the market I play in, which is VC-backed companies, we're VC-backed, we're angel-backed, but I've worked with so many CEOs in early-stage startups. And in the VC model, it's about 70% of the investment decision is all about talent. And ironically, a lot of people think it's more about product, a competitive product or intellectual property or the market size. But those other two major factors play a subordinated role related to talent. And the idea around leadership is that a good team can steer clear of a bad market. They can find a new beachhead or a new market, and they can also maneuver out of having a bad product that may not be coming together at the pace that they want it to. So I love the way Ben Horowitz talks about the role of the CEO, and he keeps it really simple. It's around setting the vision. It's about hiring the right talent and then raising the capital to fund those people and the programs that they need to put out. I like the simplicity of that model. At the same time, Vern Harnish's book, The Rockefeller Habits, where he's really modeled a lot of the thinking that people like Rockefeller in the early days and how they made their fortune by just really doing a couple of things right around planning and setting the right priorities, but then measuring progress in a really regular way with daily stand-ups and daily reporting and that whole operational accounting model, management accounting model that came into play around the time of Rockefeller. And so he kind of plays it off of Rockefeller, but a lot of these concepts are so germane to how we do business today. But lastly,
the early dashboards.
Exactly, yeah, balanced scorecards
Yep.
and such. But the thing that Vern Harnish plays or speaks to a lot, and I like the model, is that he speaks to rhythm and pacing and the whole notion of communication, and that you're really running an organization, and it's all made up of people at the end of the day. That 70% equation that Horowitz talks about, Vern Harnish talks about, it's not just enough to set your plan and get your measures out, but how you establish rhythm as a CEO and how you get people excited and how you communicate on a regular basis and incent and reward people for taking those risks and then celebrating those things that are looping back, it's absolutely key. So in many ways, he says it's all about three things. It's about the leadership, it's about the strategy you set, and then the systems and structure that you put in to support everything that you're doing as a firm. Great book.
And you know what I love about this model, especially going back to Horowitz, set the vision. You guys have said this over and over again. Again, Michael, when you took over, right? Set the vision, right? Don't be afraid to disrupt and to mix things up a little bit, but also hire the right talent. And you said, there's going to be turnover. You got it. But your point about pacing, communicating, you got to evangelize. You got to get them on the side. But also the point of recognizing that, some people aren't going to make that transition, to your point, Michael, right?
Yep.
So there's going to be turnover, and you got to be okay with that. But I mean, and your point about not just hiring the right talent, but what you're doing there with the in-house university, the training and mentoring and Toastmasters, and give them the tools to overcome their shortcomings, that's amazing. But that does all cost money, doesn't it? It does all, in fact, cost money. So why don't we segue to the next slide, gents, which is all about investment. So, Michael, I'll throw you the hard question, and while you think about it, I'm going to say something to the audience here. Michael, the hard question is, how did you fund all this? Because I'm assuming when you took over, there wasn't just a pot of gold sitting there waiting for you to make these changes. But hold that thought. Folks, we're getting near the end of the core content, so if you haven't submitted your question, start thinking about it now. These guys are brilliant with their knowledge and their experience. And by the way, they've had a few failures too. And if you ask them, they'll share them with you as well. So talk to me about investment, Michael.
Right. So you're right that it was a requirement of our partners to say, yeah, you know what, we're going to go along with this journey. We're going to attempt to be what you are envisioning us to be, but it's going to cost us some money, and you've got to be prepared for that. The other thing that was clear to us as we sort of advanced along is that all of a sudden we're playing in new arenas that perhaps were a little bit higher than what we would previously be in, and along with that comes insurance requirements. And are you covered to play in this world? So, when we move into the space that includes public companies, how do you plan for that, and how do you make sure you're protected when you get there? So for the most part, we self-funded it, but at the expense of the partners. And now I think it's starting to come around. Now we're starting to see the improvement. Now we're starting to benefit from all this, and there's been some great growth. So that's provided us with the incentive to carry on.
Now, Peter, from the tech side, you've seen, I'm sure, you talk about VCs and finding an investment. I mean, do the VCs come to you when you're pitching them? I mean, you got Expert File. This is still a fairly new venture for you, and you're growing it. Do you say, listen, I don't want to grow the product, I want to grow my people? And how does that received?
Well, I don't know if I phrase it that way. I mean, what we talk about is growth, obviously, and scale. And a company moves through different phases. I mean, in the early days, you're really all about developing your product. But I think the new way of looking at investment from early stage now, and I mentioned this notion of investing in experiments, once we know what's working before we've scaled it, we need to understand what the dynamics are there from a business model perspective. Is the technology working? Is everything coming together? Have we got the conditions for growth? And then we can actually scale it with more capital and staff up. The biggest thing that I've learned from the whole lean startup movement, and I think is really important for other organizations to look at. They can take a page from the technology industry. Lean startup essentially suggests that you should find a customer before you build a product. And this whole notion of market pain and looking for pain points and focusing on that as opposed to nice to haves, and then really looking at the response rate that you're getting from customers and studying that to death with the right measures, and then saying, okay, we've got all the kinks, all the risk sort of worked out of this, but it's still in the lab. We got to take it out for a spin now, and we need some capital for that. So really the path that we should be thinking about inside even large organizations and firms is that whole notion of what experiments are we trying? Does it look like there's promise? Have we kind of neutralized a lot of the risk before we start throwing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands into that program? And it's the whole notion of nail it and then scale it. And I don't think we're doing that enough in more traditional organizations or traditional market segments. Part of what we've seen today in this day and age is a lot of the risk taking has been kind of beaten out of people by the recessionary sort of protectionist tactics, and a lot of companies kind of sitting on massive pools of cash which haven't been deployed out of Treasury, and it's safer to buy growth through other companies. But I think the biggest issue is actually organic innovation, actually doing new projects, building stuff internally is actually much harder than it seems. That's why so many organizations are talking a good game about innovation. They want to be more like startups. But I think just getting our people around the whole concept of trying a couple of new things is the first step.
Now, I heard you mention, I'm not trying to focus in on one word, but you mentioned risk. There is risk involved in some of this.
Oh, yeah.
And Michael, you actually made a specific point of talking about protecting yourself. Is there a story there, or why is this here?
Well, from our perspective, as I said, we start to move up the food chain, and you start to move in different circles, and you start to gain the attention of people that maybe didn't really believe they were your competitors in the past, but all of a sudden they realize, holy smokes, he's sort of fishing in our pond now. So, you've got to be a bit cognizant of that and recognize that those pressures are out there. The other thing is that when you get into this new world for us, in certain cases, that's there's a better chance of some lawsuits and that sort of stuff. So you really, as you move up the chain, you got to go back to your insurance providers and say, this is sort of a new makeup of some of our clients. It's got a bit bigger risk profile, and make sure that you're adequately insured to do business with that bigger risk profile.
Mm-hmm. Spoken like a CA.
That's exactly where I was going. Yeah. So on that same CA theme, you say save for a financial rainy day. Have you had a financial rainy day?
Yes. We've had many financial rainy days over the years, but we're fortunate that if nothing else, we've been conservative accountants over the years, so we've been able to work through that. But we're not immune to that. You talk about learning from your failures. We've had a couple of those, and I've been burnt a little bit by it, sort of being a little bit overzealous, and not everything works out, and sometimes you got to draw on your savings to get through that time, and we've done that. But I think anybody that's going to plan to go down a new road, there's going to be some things there that you're not going to expect, so you should be ready for that. I
mean, that's totally in keeping with your point about experiment a little bit, right? That's you made earlier. Mm-hmm. And experimenting costs some money sometimes.
Yep.
And it can have failures, but it can also have huge gains.
Yep.
That's awesome. All right. Incentivize your staff. Peter, talk to me about this.
Well, I think Michael and I were talking before the webinar about some of the ways that we can not just use money, because that's the tried and true way that you can sort of get a baseline going, and it's how people keep score. But ironically, I think some of the biggest lift you get in somebody's emotion and excitement and their passion and they'll follow you anywhere if you can give them the right kind of incentives that are non-monetary, and it's praising them and giving them celebrating them in front of peers, and really creating a whole program around that is what some of the better companies are doing. And as a startup, as a small company, I need to get better at this as a leader, and it's something I'm focused on right now. There's something that is one of the most powerful traits of a leader that I had drilled into me way back in business school, and it's a whole notion of what they call individualized consideration. Now, it's just a fancy academic term for, really coming down to that employee's level and understanding what makes them tick and what's going on in their personal life, and making sure that you connect with them in a more meaningful way. So it's not just about money. It's about making sure that if you've got an employee that's a rabid Leafs fan, doing the extra mile to get them the right kind of tickets, or if they're a foodie, getting them to restaurants and stuff, but also doing it in a way that celebrates the fact that they can take their spouse and brag a little bit as well. Sending flowers to a valued employee. Our CMO just worked a trade show for 3 days straight and was just run off her feet for close to 25 hours on the show floor. Now, that's inhumane. I hope I'm not brought up on charges for that. Mm-hmm. But we were all working very hard as a team. But, Kara Posey, our CMO, went such an extra mile, and I wanted to really just symbolize how much I cared. We sent flowers to her house, not a small bouquet, but a big one. Unfortunately, it looked the size of a funeral arrangement when it arrived. She sent me a photo. But, it's something that her family can actually see as a visible symbol that her employer cares, and that we think she's doing a great job. And it's the kind of thing that for $125, you can't write a check to somebody. So there's a level of creativity that's required when you're a startup, especially in this. And it's something I'm trying to get better at on a regular basis, as opposed to attaboys and, just mailing it in sometimes. We can always do better.
And it's true. I know, Michael, I'm not going to put you in the spot here, but Welsh sponsors an annual beach soccer tournament. And there was some employee turnover this year, and we were left with a young gal, Rachel Graham, to run the show.
Yeah.
And she stepped up. And
Fantastic.
It was unbelievable, to your point. And what blew me away was that, Michael, you went and without anybody knowing, you guys went and gave her a card, gave her a nice little, cash thank you that was above and beyond.
Yep.
And what was amazing was that she talked to every single employee that she could about how thrilled she was. So the trickle-down effect was phenomenal, right?
Yep.
The culture was there. Actions speak louder than the words. So it's not just about the money. That's a great point. Folks, we're at Q&A. We got here a little later than we like to normally, but that's just because these guys have a lot of great value to add. So if you want, you can leave now, but this is the best part, folks. Go to the question section, add your questions, ask these guys in real time. But I want you to note a couple things. On the screen in front of you is Michael and Peter's contact information. You can email Michael. You can follow Peter on Twitter. And by the way, definitely follow Peter on Twitter. He's profound. So if there's a question that doesn't get asked today, but you want to follow up with these guys, they've already said, go ahead, knock yourself out, reach out to them. They'd love to hear. With that all said, let's maybe segue to some of the questions. Michael, I'm going to throw this one at you. This one's come in. It's a pretty cool question, actually. Hope you think so. Question is, what is the most difficult conversation you've ever had to have within your organization?
Yeah, so I've thought about that in the past too, and I think probably it was to sit down with one of my partners that didn't quite have that same vision, and this partner was questioning why would we be doing that, and how do you know what it's going to look like at the other end? So he had some valid points, and I was like, we're taking a bit of a leap of faith here, but I think really in the long run we're going to be much better for it. So trying to get these guys, and not all of them were to go directly on side, but to get them to at least acknowledge that, yeah, you know what, I'm behind you. We'll toe the company line on this, and we'll see where it all leads.
What's the other questions coming in here for both of you guys? What's a decision you guys made that you regret as it relates to, say, change management? I'm seeing, you can't see folks, but I'm seeing smiles on their faces.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we went down a couple of roads with some business lines that unfortunately just, we just didn't have the right horses in the corral at the time, and it was, it's very difficult when you view something and say, this is going to be great, this is a game changer, and then because of personalities or whatever else, you can't see it to where it should go. So that was, for me, was very difficult. Peter's had nothing but success.
I was going to say,
I said wow, because I started, my mind just raced with all sorts of things that I guess I would regret. I mean, I think they always say to think positively about the future and not regret anything, because everything is a teachable moment, a learning experience, I guess. But certainly, there are things that we could have done better. And one area I think is just moving too quick on developing a product that we didn't have product market fit for, very, very costly. So we talked earlier about experiments, but sometimes experiments can go a little bit too far. And I've seen this with companies that I've consulted to as well, where they've just gone way too far in terms of holding sacred cows up and saying that they just need to keep doubling down on what's going to be a clear market failure, and not going back and talking to customers enough is what often is the case of that. But I would say one of the bigger regrets as well is just in some cases, in the pursuit of getting product built so fast, outsourcing product development to third parties. I've been burned a number of times on that, and in particular, working on a mobile product that we couldn't build in-house, and then going out and doing it offshore was a disaster. And it's something that I think we could have actually just taken stock and said that we didn't need that in the market at the pace that I thought we needed it. So I got a little too anxious and decided that we needed a mobile complement to this particular product, and it was too much too fast, and actually a bad investment.
We're getting not just some high-level questions here, but also some very specific questions. So we'll throw this one out at you, and we'll see if we can maybe give you some free advice. Question here. What is the one best thing a not-for-profit association, having lost its operational funding, can do to become sustainable as quickly as possible?
I'll dive in on that one. I mean, it depends on what area the not-for-profit's in, and I won't ask for clues on that. But I think one of the biggest struggles that that whole industry has, and I've been to the large not-for-profit conference in the U.S. to actually do some homework on some of the issues that they're fighting, and everybody's crying the blues about funding because it's drying up within governments. Corporations are spending less on sponsorships in certain areas. I think it's important that you be perceived as a thought leader, and that you really show your expertise on a number of different topics, but try to be, again, specialized and try to appeal to certain stakeholders that are going to want to make an investment in that. I think one of the things I learned when I was at Bell Canada as an employee is Bell was really focused on two major things with its corporate giving as a corporate. And every not-for-profit wants to reach corporates, but they need to really understand what their issues are and what they care about. At the time, it was education and kids. And the whole notion of the Kids Help Phone line and them seeding as a founding donor, a 7-figure check to the Kids Help Phone. But it also tied into something that Bell did, which was connecting people through its telecom. So they kind of got that hat trick there, that they were interested in education as a potential market that they wanted to be more in, and it played off of the technologies that they sold. But they were also interested in the future, which was kids, and they were also interested in a cause that actually amplified their own vision for how they did technology. So I think one of the things you've got to do is you just can't be all things to all people. You got to stand for something, or you'll fall for anything, as Roosevelt once said. Pick a focus and then do as much primary research as you can that your budget allows, and become an acknowledged leader in that area, that specialty, and start to get some media and press, and getting profile in that area as a thought leader is one of the first steps to be taken seriously and credible in that area. And then attracting corporate and government investment then follows. It actually doesn't work the other way around.
Yeah, and I think you got to experiment too with what the alternate sources are. I know there are some great fundraising advisors here in our town, because there's just so much of this in this town. And I'm a board member with a local not-for-profit, and one thing we used to be funded by the city. That would dry up. We would had a couple corporate sponsors. They seem to now be moving in a different direction. We're contemplating a member's fee, so there's a lot of different things we can try, and we're going to do that. But I think you need to get connected too, if you can, with some of the fundraising experts in town that might have some ideas that you hadn't contemplated in the past. There's options.
And again, just remind you, the contact information for Michael and Peter is there. If you want to follow up these conversations with them, please do. Again, great question here. See if I can capture it all. A lot is being mentioned about vision and motivation and tooling of staff towards that vision. When do you decide that a vision has no future or is not feasible versus a vision that hasn't produced results but should continue? So do you cut bait early, or do you?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think if as you're going through, you're not. So really, anytime you're making a change, you're looking for baby steps. So we mean to move people forward in baby steps. And as long as we're moving forward in those baby steps, then I think we still have a shot at it, and you should stay the course. If those baby steps are stumbling and you can't even move that, then yeah, maybe it's time to rethink the vision. But as long as, in my view, if we're moving forward, even in baby steps, which is what it really mostly is, when you look back after 5 years or 10 years, you'll say, holy smokes, we started with baby steps, but we've come a long way. So, but if you can advance that meter a little bit at a time, then maybe it's time to rethink.
And that's a little bit in support of your point about, planning for the long game.
Yeah.
One of the questions here is interesting. It says, one of the statements you made at the beginning is to know your enemy. What should be done with this information?
Oh, take them out back.
Have you got a woodshed?
Yeah. Well, I think you just got to be aware, and you keep your eye on them. What's that expression? Keep your enemies closer than your friends, something like that. So I think that's what you got to do. You got to recognize who they are and be mindful of what they might be doing to throw a wrench into your plans. I don't know, Peter, maybe.
Well, I like the word asymmetric warfare, and it's I know it sounds
that's
really
2 words.
technical, but
It's
it's
2 words,
yeah, the
right?
words. An asymmetric implies that it's not a head-on collision that you're doing with your competitors, and that you're kind of going around. And it's a classic Sun Tzu approach to warfare that suggests that you're better to look for that soft underbelly, as they say, and look for areas where you can exploit some advantage. But I think one of the things that we see when we do competitive benchmarking, as I've worked with clients, we look for unrecoverable cost, which is a great accounting term. This whole notion of we add unrecoverable cost every day when we come into the office. What are we doing that could be eliminated? And again, resource allocation and putting time, people, and money against some of those experiments. But the competitive research actually should drive a lot of the decisions that are going on. I mean, they're not going to be the source of all your new ideas, but it's certainly going to give you a sense of where some of those opportunities lie before you start creating new products and services.
All right. So recognizing people probably have places to go. Top of the hour is getting close. We'll make this our last question. So you're talking about a lot about making changes, planning for the future, all that wonderful stuff, getting people to grow in themselves, what have you. So the question is this: how do you hold people accountable to that change, to producing results? Even though you're saying, reject certain deals, you're also saying don't be afraid to ask for the deal. How do you hold them accountable to making that change? How do you hold them accountable to doing that networking? How do you hold them accountable?
Well, I mean, as I said, you start with baby steps, and you make it part of their what we consider to be their job description. You provide them with the tools that they can employ to do that, and ultimately, when you evaluate them at the end of the year, you indicate whether or not they've been successful in those tasks, and if not, what can we do to make them successful? So it's and the other part of that accountability is that once the majority seems to be on side, other people, when they see it's working, when they see that the efforts results, they'll get on. So maybe at the early stages, it's more about stay the course, really celebrate the win. So when people are doing it right, really celebrate that, and it can create a little bit of tension there with the ones that aren't into it. So I think I would go that route at the outset.
All right, so let's do one final thing before we wrap this up, because we've just started the conversation here, right? The conversation needs to continue. People need to get comfortable with the concept. I've heard multiple thought leaders and books mentioned in this conversation. So why don't we give our audience some advice? What books should they be reading next?
Well, I mean, lots of stuff out there, but I mean, I've talked about a couple of things. Some of them are blogs, not even books. Vern Harnish's Rockefeller Habits is a great one that I think you can get on Amazon. And they also have a really great course for small business and mid-sized business owners is particularly good in hooking up with one of their consultants, because they actually have a whole network of people that work on that framework. And I also think Welch have got a division for that as well, not specifically the Harnish stuff, but do something similar to that.
Yep.
And also Ben Horowitz at Andreessen Horowitz blogs, a lot about talent, as I mentioned before. A couple of other ones I like a lot. I recently heard an amazing speaker who's very young, but wise beyond his years, Professor Jonah Berger, who's actually at the Wharton School of Business at UPenn. And he's got a book called Contagious that I think is really great, because he actually speaks to the fundamentals of how you make ideas go viral, both inside a company and also in the market. And he actually breaks down the fundamental principles of making things go viral. I know Made to Stick with Chip and Dan Heath. You're a big fan of those guys.
Yep.
Mike,
Switch.
You're reading their new book, Switch.
Yep.
The Heath brothers kind of did some, they touched on that a bit, but I like the way Jonah goes into it with a bit more research, and he's done it in a really engaging way. A couple of other things I'd suggest, really important that people look more at design thinking. If your product needs more aesthetic value, or you haven't designed it in a way that's engaging to customers, there's a guy named Dave Gray, Gray. If you Google him, you'll find Dave Gray's blog that comes out fresh every Sunday morning. It's free. It's amazing. Good friend of mine, actually based in St. Louis, that just writes about design thinking and how we need to think about our products in a more aesthetic way. And it's a very big part of innovation these days is the user interface. And then the last one would be a book that I stress a lot of people should look at if they're trying to optimize a lot of their processes and systems and even their business model. A guy named Alexander Osterwalder, who's based in Switzerland, and he's got a book called Business Model Innovation. And it's used extensively by, the Oakry folks, the Mars Center, Communitech, all these different innovation centers around Ontario that we have that are working with entrepreneurs. We are training a whole new generation of kids now to learn not just the technology, but also the principles of designing a business model that is really a business. And Osterwalder's kind of written the book on that.
Yeah, so finally, I love the title of this one, Strategy and the Fat Smoker, David Macer. It's a great book about, we all know it's doing what's obvious but not easy. So we all know that we should not be fat and smoking, but how do we make that change? So it's a good book.
All right, so I guess our final thoughts here, folks. We all know that managing change is never an easy task. So I'm going to bring it all together for you in the next 5 seconds. Strongly encourage you, go to Expert File. There's a lot of amazing content there and see what the experts are saying. That's where you go for those experts. But if you want a one-on-one discussion, you need some advisory services, Welsh can help you out. With that all, folks, I've enjoyed this conversation. It's all part of the Ask the Expert series. Thank you, Michael, for sharing and revealing and being honest today. Peter, same thing. Had a blast having you here. Folks, stay tuned. You will get a copy of this in the next couple of days. Send it out to your friends and your family and your peers. Post it on LinkedIn. Tweet it to the world. This is some good stuff, and they all need to know. In the meantime, have a great day. We've loved having you here. Take care. Bye-bye.